Morning and welcome to the next chapters 4, 5 and 6 of It Shouldn't Happen to a Vet by James Herriot. And I apologise if you can hear the rain and the thunder outside, but it's monsoon quality rain. So, chapter 4. It wasn't long before Greer had to return to bed. He began to groan a lot and hold his injured ribs, and soon he was reinstalled upstairs with the pillows at his back and the little pink jacket buttoned to the neck. Whisky was the only thing that gave him relief from his pain, and the level of his bedside bottle went down with remarkable speed. Life resumed its dreary pattern. Mrs. Greer was usually around when I had to report to her husband. Beyond the bedroom door there would be a lot of whispering which stopped as soon as I entered. I would receive my instructions while Mrs. Greer fussed round the bed, tucking things in, patting her husband's brow with a folded handkerchief, and all the time darting little glances of dislike at me. Immediately I got outside the door, the whispering started again. It was quite late one evening, about 10 o'clock, when the call from Mrs. Mallard came in. Her dog had a bone in its throat, and would Mr. Greer come at once? I was starting to say that he was ill, and I was doing his work, but it was too late. There was a click as the receiver went down at the other end. Greer reacted to the news by going into a sort of trance. His chin sank on his chest, and he sat immobile for nearly a minute, while he gave the matter careful thought. Then he straightened up suddenly and stabbed a finger at me. "It'll not be a bone in its throat. It'll only be a touch of pharyngitis making it cough." I was surprised at his confidence. "Don't you think I'd better take some long forceps, just in case?" "No, I've told ye now. There'll be no bone, so go down and put up some of the syrup of squills and ipecacuanha mixture. That's it, all it'll want. And another thing, if you can't find anything wrong, don't say so. Tell the lady it's pharyngitis and how to treat it. You have to justify your visit, you can." I felt a little bewildered as I filled a 4-ounce bottle in the dispensary, but I took a few pairs of forceps with me too. I had lost a bit of faith in Greer's long-range diagnosis. I was surprised when Mrs. Mallard opened the door of the smart semi-detached house. For some reason I had been expecting an old lady, and here was a striking-looking blonde woman of about 40 with her hair piled high in glamorous layers as was the fashion at that time. And I hadn't expected the long ballroom dress in shimmering green, the enormous swaying earrings, the heavily made-up face. Mrs. Mallard seemed surprised too. She stared blankly at me till I explained the situation. "I've come to see your dog. I'm Mr. Greer's locum. He's ill at the moment, I'm afraid." It took a fair time for the information to get through, because she still stood on the doorstep, as if she didn't know what I was talking about. Then she came to life and opened the door wide. "Oh yes, of course. I'm sorry. Do come in." I walked past her through an almost palpable wall of perfume and into a room on the left of the hall. The perfume was even stronger in here, but it was in keeping with the single pink-tinted lamp, which shed a dim but rosy light on the wide divan drawn close to the flickering fire. Somewhere in the shadows, a radiogram was softly pouring out Body and Soul. There was no sign of my patient, and Mrs. Mallard looked at me irresolutely, fingering one of her earrings. Do you want me to see him in here?" I asked. "Oh yes, certainly." She became brisk and opened the door at the end of the room. Immediately, a little West Highland terrier bounded across the carpet and hurled itself at me with a whoop of delight. He tried his best to lick my face by a series of mighty springs, and this might have gone on for quite a long time had I not caught him in mid-air. Mrs. Mallard smiled nervously. "He seems a lot better now," she said. I flopped down on the divan, still with the little dog in my arms, and prized open his jaws. Even in that dim light it was obvious that there was nothing in his throat. I gently slid my forefinger over the back of his tongue, and the terrier made no protest as I explored his gullet. Then I dropped him down on the carpet and took his temperature. Normal. "Well, Mrs. Mallard," I said, "there is certainly no bone in his throat, and he has no fever." I was about to add that the dog seemed perfectly fit to me when I remembered Greer's parting admonition. I had to justify my visit. I cleared my throat. "It's just possible, though, that he has a little pharyngitis, which has been making him cough or retch." I opened the terrier's mouth again. "As you see, the back of his throat is rather inflamed. He may have got a mild infection in there, or perhaps swallowed some irritant. I have some medicine in the car which will soon put him right." Realising I was beginning to gabble, I brought my speech to a close. Mrs. Mallard hung on every word, peering anxiously into the little dog's mouth, and nodding her head rapidly. "Oh, yes, I do see," she said. "Thank you so much. What a good thing I sent for you." On the following evening I was halfway through a busy surgery when a fat man in a particularly vivid tweed jacket bustled in and deposited a sad-eyed basset hound on the table. "Shaking his head about a bit," he boomed. "Think he must have a touch of canker." I got an oroscope from the instrument cupboard and had begun to examine the ear when the fat man started again. "I see you were out our way last night. I live next door to Mrs. Mallard." "Oh, yes," I said, peering down the lighted metal tube. "That's right, I was." The man drummed his finger on the table for a moment. "Aye, that dog must have a lot of ailments. The vet's car seems always to be outside the house." "Really? I shouldn't have thought so. Seemed a healthy little thing to me." I finished examining one ear and started on the other. "Well, it's just as I say," said the man. "The poor creature's always in trouble, and it's funny how often it happens at night." I looked up quickly. There was something odd in the way he said that. He looked at me for a moment with a kind of wide-eyed innocence, then his whole face creased into a knowing leer. I stared at him. "You can't mean—" "Not with that ugly old devil, you mean, eh? Takes a bit of reckoning up, doesn't it?" The eyes in the big red face twinkled with amusement. I dropped the oroscope on the table with a clatter, and my arms fell by my sides. "Don't look like that, lad," shouted the fat man, giving me a playful punch in the chest. "It's the wrong old world, you know." But it wasn't. Just the thought of Greer that was filling me with horror. It was the picture of myself in that harem atmosphere pontificating about pharyngitis against a background of body and soul to a woman who knew I was talking rubbish. In another 2 days, Angus Greer was out of bed and apparently recovered. Also, a replacement assistant had been engaged and was due to take up his post immediately. I was free to go. Having said I would leave first thing in the morning, I was out of the house by 6:30 a.m. in order to make Darrowby by breakfast. I wasn't going to face any more of that porridge. As I drove west across the plain of York, I began to catch glimpses over the hedge-tops and between the trees of the long spine of the Pennines, lifting into the morning sky. They were pale violet at this distance and still hazy in the early sunshine, but they beckoned to me. And later, when the little car pulled harder against the rising ground, and the trees became fewer, and the hedges gave way to the clean limestone walls, I had the feeling I always had of the world opening out, of shackles falling away, and there at last was Darrowby, sleeping under the familiar bulk of Herne Fell, and beyond the great green folds of the dales. Nothing stirred as I rattled across the cobbled marketplace, then down the quiet street to Skeldale House, with the ivy hanging in untidy profusion from its old bricks, and Siegfried Farnham, MRCVS, on the lopsided brass plate. I think I would have galloped along the passage beyond the glass door, but I had to fight my way through the family dogs, all 5 of them, who surged around me, leaping and barking in delight. I almost collided with the formidable bulk of Mrs. Hall, who was carrying the coffee pot out of the dining room. "You're back then," she said, and I could see she was really pleased because she almost smiled. "Well, go in and get sat down, I've got a bit of home cured in the pan for you." My hand was on the door when I heard the brothers' voices inside. Tristan was mumbling something and Siegfried was in full cry. "Where the hell were you last night, anyway? I heard you banging about at 3 o'clock in the morning, and your room stinks like a brewery. God, I wish you could see yourself. Eyes like puzzles in the snow." Smiling to myself, I pushed open the door. I went over to Tristan, who stared up in surprise as I seized his hand and began to pump it. He looked as boyishly innocent as ever, except for the eyes, which, though a little sunken, still held their old gleam. Then I approached Siegfried at the head of the table. Obviously startled at my formal entry, he had choked in mid-chew, he reddened, tears coursed down his thin cheeks, and the small sandy moustache quivered. Nevertheless, he rose from his chair, inclined his head, and extended his hand with the grace of a marquis. "Welcome, James," spraying me lightly with toast crumbs. "Welcome home." Chapter 5. I had been away for only 2 weeks, but it was enough to bring it home to me afresh that working in the high country had something for me that was missing elsewhere. My first visits took me up on one of the narrow, unfenced roads which join Silldale and Cosdale, and when I had ground my way to the top in bottom gear, I did what I so often did, pulled the car onto the roadside turf and got out. That quotation about not having time to stand and stare has never applied to me. I seem to have spent a good part of my life, probably too much, in just standing and staring, and I was at it again this morning. From up here you could see away over the plain of York to the sprawl of the Hambleton Hills, 40 miles to the east, while behind me the ragged miles of moorland rolled away, dipping and rising over the flat fell top. In my year at Darrowby I must have stood here scores of times, and the view across the plain looked always different. Sometimes in the winter the low country was a dark trough between the snow-covered Pennines and the distant white gleam of the Hambletons, and in April the rain squalls drifted in slow, heavy veils across the great green and brown dappled expanse. There was a day, too, when I stood in brilliant sunshine looking down over miles of thick fog, like a rippling layer of cotton wool, with dark tufts of trees and hilltops pushing through here and there. But today the endless patchwork of fields slumbered in the sun, and the air, even on the hill, was heavy with the scents of summer. There must be people working among the farms down there, I knew, but I couldn't see a living soul, and the peace which I always found in the silence and the emptiness of the moors filled me utterly. At these times I often seemed to stand outside myself, calmly assessing my progress. It was easy to flick back over the years, right back to the time I had decided to become a veterinary surgeon. I could remember the very moment. I was 13, and I was reading an article about careers for boys in the Meccano magazine, and as I read, I felt a surging conviction that this was for me. And yet what was it based upon? Only that I liked dogs and cats and didn't care much for the idea of an office life. It seemed a frail basis on which to build a career. I knew nothing about agriculture or about farm animals, and though during the years in college I learned about these things, I could see only one future for myself. I was going to be a small animal surgeon. This lasted right up to the time I qualified. A kind of vision of treating people's pets in my own animal hospital, where everything would be not just modern but revolutionary. The fully equipped operating theatre, laboratory, and X-ray room, they had all stayed crystal clear in my mind until I had graduated MRCVS. How on earth then did I come to be sitting on a high Yorkshire moor in shirt sleeves and Wellingtons, smelling vaguely of cows? The change in my outlook had come quite quickly, in fact almost immediately after my arrival in Darrowby. The job had been a godsend in those days of high unemployment, but only I had thought a stepping stone to my real ambition. But everything had switched round, almost in a flash. Maybe it was something to do with the incredible sweetness of the air, which still took me by surprise when I stepped out into the old wild garden at Skeldale House every morning. Or perhaps the daily piquancy of life in the graceful old house with my gifted but mercurial boss Siegfried and his reluctant student brother Tristan. Or it could be that it was just the realization that treating cows and pigs and sheep and horses had a fascination I had never even suspected, and this brought with it a new concept of myself as a tiny wheel in the great machine of British agriculture. There was a kind of solid satisfaction in that. Probably it was because I hadn't dreamed there was a place like the Dales. I hadn't thought it possible that I could spend all my days in a high, clean-blown land where the scent of grass or trees was never far away, and where even in the driving rain of winter I could sniff the air and find the freshness of growing things hidden somewhere in the cold clasp of the wind. Anyway, it had all changed for me, and my work consisted now of driving from farm to farm across the roof of England with a growing conviction that I was a privileged person. I got back into the car and looked at my list of visits. It was good to be back, and the day passed quickly. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening, when I thought I had finished, that I had a call from Terry Watson, a young farm worker who kept 2 cows of his own. One of them, he said, had summer mastitis. Mid-July was a bit early for this, but in the latest summer months we saw literally hundreds of these cases. In fact, a lot of the farmers called it August bag. It was an unpleasant condition because it was just about incurable, and usually resulted in the cow losing a quarter, the area of the udder which supplies each teat with milk, and sometimes even her life. Terry Watson's cow looked very sick. She had limped in from the field at milking time, swinging her right hind leg wide to keep it away from the painful udder, and now she stood trembling in her stall, her eyes staring anxiously in front of her. I drew gently at the affected teat, and instead of milk, a stream of dark, foul-smelling serum spurted into the tin can I was holding. "No mistaking that stink, Terry," I said. "It's the real summer type, all right." I felt my way over the hot, swollen quarter, and the cow lifted her leg quickly as I touched the tender tissue. Pretty hard, too. It looks bad, I'm afraid. Terry's face was grim as he ran his hand along the cow's back. He was in his early 20s, had a wife and a small baby, and was one of the breed who was prepared to labour all day for somebody else, and then come home and start work on his own food stock. His 2 cows, his few pigs and hens, made a big difference to somebody who had to live on 30 shillings a week. "I can't understand it," he muttered. "It's usually dry cows that get it, and this one's still giving 2 gallons a day. I'd have been on with tar if only she'd been dry." The farmers used to dab the teats of the dry cows with Stockholm tar to keep off the flies which were blamed for carrying the infection. "No, I'm afraid all cows can get it, especially the ones that are beginning to dry off." I pulled the thermometer from the rectum. It said 106. "What's going to happen then? Can you do out for her?" "I'll do what I can, Terry. I'll give her an injection, and you must strip the teat out as often as you can. But you know as well as I do that it's a poor outlook with these jobs." "Aye, I know all about it." He watched me gloomily as I injected the Corin Pyogenes toxoid into the cow's neck. "Even now we are still doing this for summer mastitis, because it is a sad fact that none of the modern range of antibiotics has much effect on it. She'll lose her quarter, won't she? And maybe she'll even peg out." I tried to be cheerful. "Well, I don't think she'll die, and even if the quarter goes, she'll make it up on the other 3. But there was the feeling of helplessness I always had when I could do little about something which mattered a great deal, because I knew what a blow this was to the young man. A 3-teated cow has lost a lot of her market value, and this was about the best outcome I could see. I didn't like to think about the possibility of the animal dying. "Look, is there nought at all I can do myself? Is the job a button, do you think?" Terry Watson's thin cheeks were pale, and as I looked at the slender figure with the slightly stooping shoulders, I thought, not for the first time, that he didn't look robust enough for his hard trade. I can't guarantee anything, I said, but the cases that do best are the ones that get the most stripping. So work away at it this evening, every half hour if you can manage it. That rubbish in her quarter can't do any harm if you draw it out as soon as it is formed, and I think you ought to bathe the udder with warm water and massage it well. What'll I rub it with? Oh, it doesn't matter what you use. The main thing is to move the tissue about so that you can get more of that stinking stuff out. Vaseline would do nicely. I've got a bowl of goose grease. Okay, use that. I reflected there must be a bowl of goose grease on most farms. It was the all-purpose lubricant and liniment for man and beast. Terry seemed relieved at the opportunity to do something. He fished out an old bucket, tucked the milking stool between his legs, and crouched down against the cow. He looked up at me with a strangely defiant expression. Right, he said, I'm starting now. As it happened, I was called out early the next morning to a milk fever, and on the way home I decided to look in at the Watsons' cottage. It was about 8 o'clock, and when I entered the little two-stall shed, Terry was in the same position as I had left him on the previous night. He was pulling at the infected teat, eyes closed, cheek resting against the cow's flank. He started as though roused from sleep when I spoke. Hello, you're having another go, I see. The cow looked round too at my words, and I saw immediately with a thrill of pleasure that she was immeasurably improved. She had lost her blank stare and was looking at me with the casual interest of the healthy bovine, and best of all, her jaws were moving with that slow, regular, lateral grind that every vet loves to see. My God, Terry, she looks a lot better. She isn't like the same cow. The young man seemed to have difficulty in keeping his eyes open, but he smiled. Aye, and come and have a look at this end. He rose slowly from the stool, straightened his back a little bit at a time, and leaned his elbow on the cow's rump. I bent down by the udder, feeling carefully for the painful swelling of last night, but my hand came up against a smooth, yielding surface, and in disbelief I kneaded the tissue between my fingers. The animal showed no sign of discomfort. What with a feeling of bewilderment, I drew on the teat with thumb and forefinger. The quarter was nearly empty, but I did manage to squeeze a single jet of pure white milk onto my palm. What's going on here, Terry? You must have switched cows on me. You're having me on, aren't you? Nay, governor, the young man said with his slow smile. It's same cow, all right. She's better, that's all. But it's impossible. What the devil have you done to her? Just what you told me to do. Rub and strip. I scratched my head. But she's back to normal. I've never seen anything like it. Aye, I know you haven't. I know you haven't. It was a woman's voice, and I turned and saw young Mrs. Watson standing at the door holding her baby. You've never seen a man that would rub and strip a cow right round the clock, have you? Round the clock? I said. She looked at her husband with a mixture of concern and exasperation. Yes, he's been there on that stool since you left last night. Never been to bed. Never been in for a meal. I've been bringing him bits and pieces and cups of tea. Great fool. It's enough to kill anybody. I looked at Terry, and my eyes moved from the pallid face over the thin, slightly swaying body to the nearly empty body of goose grease at his feet. Good Lord, man, I said, you've done the impossible, but you must be about all in. Anyway, your cow is as good as new. You don't need to do another thing to her, so you can go in and have a bit of a rest. Nay, I can't do that. He shook his head and straightened his shoulders. I've got me work to go to, and I'm late as it is. Chapter 6. I couldn't help feeling just a little bit smug as I squeezed the bright red rubber ball out through the incision in the dog's stomach. We got enough small animal work in Darrowby to make a pleasant break from our normal life around farms, but not enough to make us blasé. No doubt the man with an intensive town practice looks on a gastrotomy as a fairly routine and unexciting event, But as I watched the little ball roll along the table and bounce on the surgery floor, a glow of achievement filled me. The big lolloping red setter pup had been brought in that morning. His mistress said that he had been trembling, miserable, and occasionally vomiting for 2 days, ever since their little girl's ball had mysteriously disappeared. Diagnosis had not been difficult. I inverted the lips of the stomach wound and began to close it with a continuous suture. I was feeling pleasantly relaxed, unlike Tristan, who had been unable to light a woodbine because of the ether which bubbled in the glass bottle behind him, and out through the anaesthetic mask which he held over the dog's face. He stared moodily down at the patient, and the fingers of his free hand drummed on the table. But it was soon my turn to be tense, because the door of the operating room burst open, and Siegfried strode in. I don't know why it was, but whenever Siegfried watched me do anything, I started to go to pieces. Great waves seemed to billow from him. Impatience, frustration, criticism, irritation. I could feel the waves buffeting me now, although my employer's face was expressionless. He was standing quietly at the end of the table, but as the minutes passed I had the growing impression of a volcano on the bubble. The eruption came when I began to stitch the deep layer of the abdominal muscle. I was pulling a length of catgut from a glass jar when I heard a sharp intake of breath. "God help us, James," cried Siegfried. "Stop pulling at that bloody gut. Do you know how much that stuff costs per foot?" "Well, it's a good job you don't, or you'd faint dead away. And that expensive dusting powder you've been chucking about, there must be about half a pound of it inside that dog right now." He paused and breathed heavily for a few moments. "Another thing, if you want to swab, a little bit of cotton wool is enough. You don't need a square foot at a time like you've been using. Here, give me that needle. Let me show you." He hastily scrubbed his hands and took over. First he took a minute pinch of the iodoform powder and sprinkled it daintily into the wound, rather like an old lady feeding her goldfish. Then he cut off a tiny piece of gut and inserted a continuous suture in the muscle. He had hardly left himself enough to tie the knot at the end, and it was touch and go, but he just made it after a few moments of intense concentration. The process was repeated about 10 times as he closed the skin wound with interrupted silk sutures, his nose almost touching the patient as he laboriously tied off each little short end with forceps. When he had finished he was slightly pop-eyed. "Right, turn off the ether, Tristan," he said, as he pulled off half an inch of wool and primly wiped the wound down. He turned to me and smiled gently. With dismay I saw that his patient look was spreading over his face. "James, please don't misunderstand me. You've made a grand job of this dog, but you've got to keep one eye on the economic side of things. I know it doesn't matter a hoot to you just now, but some day, no doubt, you'll have your own practice, and then you'll realise some of the worries I have on my shoulders." He patted my arm, and I steeled myself as he put his head on one side, and a hint of roguishness crept into his smile. "After all, James, you'll agree it is desirable to make some sort of profit in the end." It was a week later, and I was kneeling on the neck of a sleeping colt in the middle of a field. The sun was hot on the back of my neck as I looked down at the peacefully closed eyes, the narrow face disappearing into the canvas chloroform muzzle. I tipped a few more drops of the anaesthetic onto the sponge and screwed the cap onto the bottle. He had had about enough now. I couldn't count the number of times Siegfried and I have enacted this scene, the horse on his grassy bed, my employer cutting away at one end while I watched the head. Siegfried was a unique combination of born horseman and dexterous surgeon with which I couldn't compete, so I had inevitably developed into an anaesthetist. We liked to do the operations in the open. It was cleaner, and if the horse was wild he stood less chance of injuring himself. We just hoped for a fine morning, and today we were lucky. In the early haze I looked over the countless buttercups. The field was filled with them, and it was like sitting in a shimmering yellow ocean. Their pollen had powdered my shoes and the neck of the horse beneath me. Everything had gone off, more or less, as it usually did. I had gone into the box with the colt, buckled on the muzzle underneath his head collar, then walked him quietly out to a soft, level spot in the field. I left a man at the head holding a long shank on the head collar and poured the first half-ounce of chloroform onto the sponge, watching the colt snuffling and shaking his head at the strange scent. As the man walked him slowly round, I kept adding a little more chloroform till the colt began to stagger and sway. This stage always took a few minutes, and I waited confidently for Siegfried's little speech, which always came about now. I was not disappointed. "He isn't going to go down, you know, James. Don't you think we should tie a foreleg up?" I adopted my usual policy of feigning deafness, and a few seconds later the colt gave a final lurch and collapsed on his side. Siegfried, released from his enforced inactivity, sprang into action. "Sit on his head," he yelled. "Get a rope on that upper hind leg and pull it forward. Bring me that bucket of water over here. Come on, move." It was a violent transition. Just moments ago peace and silence, and now men scurrying in all directions, bumping into each other, urged on by Siegfried's cries. 30 years later I am still dropping horses for Siegfried, and he is still saying, "He isn't going to go down, James." These days I mostly use an intravenous injection of thiopentone, and it puts a horse out in about 10 seconds. It doesn't give Siegfried much time to say his piece, but he usually gets it in somewhere between the 7th and 10 seconds. This morning's course was an injury, but it was a pretty dramatic one, justifying general anaesthetic to repair it. The colt, bred from a fine hunter mare, had been galloping round his paddock and had felt the urge to visit the outside world. He had chosen the only sharp fence post to try to jump over and had been impaled between the forelegs. In his efforts to escape he had caused so much damage in the breast region that it looked like something from a butcher's shop, with the skin extensively lacerated and the big sternal muscles hanging out, chopped through as though by a cleaver. "Roll him on his back," said Siegfried. "That's better." He took a probe from the tray which lay on the grass nearby and carefully explored the wound. "No damage to the bone," he grunted, still peering into the depths. Then he took a pair of forceps and fished out all the loose debris he could find before turning to me. "It's just a big stitching job. You can carry on if you like." As we changed places it occurred to me that he was disappointed it was not something more interesting. I couldn't see him asking me to take over in a rig operation or something like that. Then, as I picked up the needle, my mind clicked back to that gastrotomy on the dog. Maybe I was on trial for my wasteful ways. This time I would be on my guard. I threaded the needle with a minute length of gut, took a bite at the severed muscle, and with an effort stitched it back into place. But it was a laborious business tying the little short ends. It was taking me at least 3 times as long as it should. However, I stuck to it doggedly. I had been warned, and I didn't want another lecture. I had put in 6 suitors in this way when I began to feel the waves. My employer was kneeling close to me on the horse's neck, and the foaming breakers of disapproval were crashing into me from close range. I held out for another 2 suitors, then Siegfried exploded in a fierce whisper. "What the hell are you playing at, James?" "Well, just stitching." "What do you mean?" "But why are you buggering about with those little bits of gut? We'll be here all bloody day." I fumbled another knot into the muscle. "For reasons of economy," I whispered back virtuously. Siegfried leaped from the neck as though the horse had bitten him. "I can't stand any more of this. Here, let me have a go." He strode over to the tray, selected a needle, and caught hold of the free end of the catgut protruding from the jar. With a skiving sweep of his arm, he pulled forth an enormous coil of gut, setting the bobbin inside the jar, whirring wildly like a salmon reel with a big fish on the line. He returned to the horse, stumbling slightly as the gut caught round his ankles, and began to stitch. It wasn't easy, because even at the full stretch of his arm, he was unable to pull the suture tight and had to keep getting up and down. By the time he had tacked the muscles back into their original positions, he was puffing, and I could see a faint dew of perspiration on his forehead. "Drop of blood seeping from somewhere down there," he muttered, and visited the tray again, where he tore savagely at a huge roll of cotton wool. Trailing untidy white streamers over the buttercups, he returned and swabbed out the wound with one corner of the mass. Back to the tray again. "Just a touch of powder before I stitch the skin," he said lightly, and seized a 2-pound carton. He poised for a moment over the wound, then began to dispense the powder with extravagant jerks of the wrist. A considerable amount did go into the wound, but much more floated over other parts of the horse, over me, over the buttercups, and a particularly wayward flick obscured the sweating face of the man on the foot rope. When he had finished coughing, he looked very like Coco the Clown. Siegfried completed the closure of the skin, using several yards of silk, and when he stood back and surveyed the tidy result, I could see he was in excellent humour. "Well now, that's fine. A young horse like that will heal in no time. Shouldn't be surprised if it doesn't even leave a mark." He came over and addressed me as I washed the instruments in the bucket. "Sorry I pushed you out like that, James, but honestly I couldn't think what had come over you. You were like an old hen. You know it looks bad trying to work with piddling little amounts of materials. One has to operate with a certain, panache, if I can put it that way, and you just can't do that if you stint yourself." I finished washing the instruments, dried them off, and laid them on the enamel tray. Then I lifted the tray and set off for the gate at the end of the field. Siegfried, walking alongside me, laid his hand on my shoulder. "Mind you, don't think I'm blaming you, James. It's probably your Scottish upbringing. And don't misunderstand me, this same upbringing has inculcated in you so many of the qualities I admire: integrity, industry, loyalty. But I'm sure you will be the first to admit," and here he stopped and wagged a finger at me, "that you Scots sometimes overdo the thrift." He gave a light laugh. "So remember, James, don't be too, canny when you are operating." I measured him up. If I dropped the tray quickly, I felt sure I could fell him with a right hook. Siegfried went on, "But I know I don't have to ramble on at you, James. You always pay attention to what I say, don't you?" I tucked the tray under my arm and set off again. "Yes," I replied, "I do. Every single time."